So in a previous video, I went over the pros and cons of starting a legacy vampire counts army for Warhammer the Old World. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to build that army starting from scratch in the most efficient way possible. As I am sure you are well aware, vampire counts are not an official army for the Old World, at least at this time, so there are no official kits being released specifically for the Old World, so we might have to get a little creative here, but that also means you shouldn't feel bad for using Etsy or other third-party suppliers for our units. In this video, I'm going to try to talk you through starting at 500 points and growing that army to around 2,000 points with a fairly well-balanced list. If you are in a hyper-competitive group and just want to build a screamer list, which is a little cheesy and has the possibility of being nerfed in the future, at the very end of this video, I will cover how to build that. It plays very differently and looks very different than an average vampire counts army. So if that's your goal, you need to build your army in a completely different way that I'll cover at the very end. But for the rest of you, let's get started with a balanced 500 point army for Warhammer the Old World. So before I really dig into this list I put together, let me just say this game is not balanced around 500 points. And it is not easy to put together a balanced 500 point list. You're going to come up with some other people who are going to be really weak at 500, and you're going to play some armies that are going to be really busted at 500 points. But in this list I put together, I tried to make something that showed you a lot of different phases of the game. That gives you a lot of practice using various rules and can hopefully hold its own at 500 points. Most importantly though, I feel like this is a list you can really grow your army with. Despite being called vampire counts, necromancers are actually much more useful and much more powerful this edition, so we're going to start out with a necromancer general, and then we will include the right lord because they're cool. It's a nice little beat stick for you, and it's a fun model to paint. We have a large blob of zombies here. These are going to be your tar pit. You're going to want to get units to attack this unit and make them stuck in this unit as you keep on reviving zombies with your necromancer. If you want to exchange the zombies for skeletons, by all means, that's your choice. I get it, skeletons are cool. However, zombies are the more efficient unit this edition. Skeletons are slightly stronger, but they are also more expensive, and for the most part, I don't care how much wounds these zombies are putting out or these skeletons would put out. I just want them to be a tar pit for enemy units to get stuck in. In this way, they perform very similarly, but zombies are cheaper. But more importantly, zombies have the newly raised rule, which means I can raise more zombies than I originally bring to the game, which skeletons don't have, which is absolutely vital to how vampire counts work this edition. Purchasing only 20 zombies but making your opponent deal with 40 zombies is a huge advantage you shouldn't give up. But if you really like skeletons aesthetically, you can switch those in and just remove some points somewhere else on the list. Direwolves are to give you some mobility, so you can hopefully get to a backline artillery piece if somebody brings them to a 500 point game. Or if you have no artillery to deal with, use these to screen your other units so you can help dictate charges on your own terms. And then you have a small unit of both Grave Guard and Crypt Ghouls. These are going to help be a little bit of punch. They are small units now, but we will grow these as we get to larger point values. The biggest problem this list will have, it is very slow. It is not mobile at all. That is a big weakness of vampire counts in general, is getting their undead units across the board. But in a 500 point game, you're kind of limited in options, so the most you can do right here is make good use of your necromancer to cast spells to up your movement, to get your units across the board so they can actually do something. Before I really try to suss out the most efficient way to build this 500 point army, I should point out that all Warhammer armies have a lot of third-party options available to you, and vampire counts are one of the easiest ones to use third-party proxies for because the army on the whole is fairly generic. I'm not going to go through every third-party option available for you because they are basically limited lists. I will just point out a few I really like, but I will say if you have any interest in third-party miniatures at all, you should probably get in touch with the Ninth Age website forums. For those of you who don't know, the Ninth Age sprung out after GW dropped support for Warhammer Fantasy. They created their own world with their own lore, and they tried to build new rules using old Warhammer models. But because GW stopped supporting and selling a lot of the range, these players look to third-party manufacturers to fill the void, and they compiled these large lists of places to get third-party models. And if you go to their thread for vampire counts, you can see discussions on GW's models, how they fit with scaling, and tons of different third-party options that you could use for making your own vampire counts army. Again, if you're using third-party miniatures at all, or even thinking about it, this thread for this army and other armies is an absolutely invaluable resource. I will definitely drop a link in the description for this video because this forum is definitely worth checking out for these threads alone. But if you find those options overwhelming and you want to go third party but don't want to put a lot of work into searching models out, honestly, just Google Highland Miniatures, find their vampire count proxies. This is probably the best company doing Warhammer proxies right now. Their sculpts across many armies are amazing. They're very affordable. If you don't have a 3D printer, just go on Etsy, find someone else printing them, get them for you, probably print them in a 32mm scale, and you're good to go. So back to the task at hand, starting to build this 500 point army. I'm just going to rip this band-aid off and say there is not a great bundle for vampire counts sold by GW right now. As of the time I'm recording this video, GW has replaced their Start Collecting sets with Spearhead for Age of Sigmar, and the Spearhead that you would use for vampire counts is not going to help much with your 500 point army. The savings from buying this as a bundle rather than separate at retail is not really there. This might be worthwhile if you want to use skeletons over zombies, just because it's convenient to get all these things here, and while you're not using the Blood Knights and Vampire Lord of Argyce now, you will probably have use for them as you build larger lists than 500 points. And even then, to be honest with you, I have issues with GW's new skeleton set. I don't deny that each individual skeleton looks really great and is a really good option for a skirmish game like Age of Sigmar. The problem is, because each of your zombies are in these dynamic pulls, they're not very modular, which means each model makes basically what you see on the screen in front of you and can't really be changed much beside that. And while one skeleton doing a sweeping motion with his spear is really cool, to have 5 of them doing the exact same movement at the exact same time looks really weird in a rank and file game. That is, of course, just my opinion, and other people like them, other people use them, and you can get these to rank up on the proper base. If you want to start your army with a bundle that actually has some value, if you're lucky, you can go to your local game store, shop online, or even eBay and find the old Start Collecting Soulblight Gravelord box for a still fair price. Only the Graveguard will probably be used in your small 500 point army games, and not even all of them, but all of these units will help you as you start fleshing out your army into bigger point sizes. So if you can find this at near the price it was supposed to sell at retail, this is something that's really smart to pick up. But unfortunately, besides that old box, the most efficient way to build out the start of this 500 point army is buying individual kits. The old Necromancer and White King are still being sold by GW, are still fantastic kits, and I highly recommend you pick them up. You might have to find a square base for them, but these are a good place to start. If you are new to miniature painting in general, both of these models are really great as a first hero model and will help you learn a lot of techniques. GW does sell a current new zombie kit, and while I like these more than I like their new skeletons, they are still kinda extra and a little controversial. There's just a lot of weird parts, like with the zombie walking around with a tombstone on his back. Like that's not cool, that's just really stupid. And that's something you gotta deal with if you use this kit. And while all these extra details might be aesthetically nice and technically impressive, it makes it harder to paint up large hordes of these because they'll slow you down while you paint, and for your vampire counts army you're going to need a lot. And like the skeletons, they are super dynamic, but I feel like that works better for zombies. But my recommendation, just to not double up on the same poses in these weird formations, is to just buy one kit and supplement it with other things. The old Warhammer zombie kit is still pretty easy to find and still relatively affordable, but what I would actually recommend doing is taking a look at Fireforge. Fireforge makes two kits that are really awesome, one for zombie soldiers and one for zombie citizens, which are basically zombie peasants. These kits are very affordable, they're modular, which means parts can kind of interchange with each other, and they scale really well next to GW zombies, at least the old zombies. I have no idea about the new weird zombies with gravestones on their back. But for the old zombies and these two kits, they combine together really well. And anyways, this is one of those cases where some size disparity would actually look really good. And so if you go this direction, I think you get a much more interesting zombie horde with civilians and women and soldiers too. So it actually looks like you're raising a diverse group of undead zombies. That's actually really cool. If you wanted to further this, you could easily find undead skeletons and undead zombies of other races on Etsy or other 3D print suppliers. There is no lore reason why all the undead are just human in Warhammer Fantasy. It's just a limitation of the sculpting process. It makes a lot of sense to add zombie goblins or zombie orcs or zombie beastmen or skeletons to your army. I especially like using large minotaurs or large orcs. You can put these on larger bases and they work really well as a unit filler and help add a lot of coolness to your units. Pictured here, these sculpts are from Avatars of War. These are the ones I use myself and I cannot recommend them enough. They're absolutely phenomenal sculpts. Furthermore, you can easily supplement this. Zombies are really easy to make rank fillers for. Throw on a few tombstones on a larger base or have like a big spooky undead tree. You probably get those really cheap being printed off of Etsy and could really stretch out your dollar. As a particular vendor call out, Highland Miniatures does really good unit filler items that you can paint up that look really nice that people will be happy to see as a rank filler. If you can't get your hands on the old Start Collecting box, definitely pick up a box of Graveguard. You're going to use them a lot and it's one of the coolest undead kits in my opinion that GW makes. They also have older sculpts as well if you want to add some variety, but those get a little expensive. As far as direwolves go, you're going to have a lot of choices. I really do like the new GW sculpt, although at $60 it seems really expensive for direwolves. I should point out that right now GW is selling a bundle they call Fang of the Blood Queen, which includes 10 direwolves, 3 fellbats, and 1 vampire. The vampire herself is pretty cool, but she comes with a snake on her base and you might have a hard time fitting her on the right size base for the old world, but might be worth checking out and purchasing if you like the style of vampire. If you don't want to drop a lot of money on wolves, and I wouldn't blame you, definitely check out Highland Miniatures. The new Crypt Ghoul box is actually really nice, and with 20 figures in a box, the price actually isn't all that bad as far as GW goes. That being said, the older kit for Crypt Ghouls is still around and easily available on eBay. I can usually find those for cheaper than the new kit, and they still look pretty good as well. And again, it's pretty easy to supplement Crypt Ghouls with scary trees or tombstones for rank fillers. So yeah, that's our shopping list for our first 500 points. Admittedly, there's not a good bundle here and that really sucks, but for a lot of these things you're buying, you're going to buy a little bit of extra models you're going to use later, which will help out. And it's super easy to save some money using third-party zombies, and I believe your end results of your army will look a lot better for it. So from our 500 point, we now take that same list and grow to a 1,000 point army. In doing this, I'm going to follow basic escalation league rules to where I cannot remove units that I build, I can only add to them. The only time we will really be removing a unit per se is when we're taking something like a necromancer and putting him on a mount rather than on foot. So with no further delay, here is my 1,000 point army list. So the first thing you should notice, or at least the first thing I hope you notice, is that most of the expense of this 1,000 point list you've already purchased for the 500 point list. Only new thing that you should really have to buy at this point should be your Blood Knights. Roiding up the Necromancer to level 4 and adding those Vampire Knights are the things that take up most of the 500 points we added to this. Everything else we added to the Graveguard to make them a bigger and more effective unit. Now, I should say at this point that Blood Knights are probably the single most powerful unit in the Vampire Accounts book. And there are some groups or some leagues that might not allow a Lord level character at this low of a point game. If that is the case for your group, drop the Necromancer back to a level that's acceptable and take those points and add a Vampire Thrall. The Blood Knights could also be replaced with Black Knights pretty easily, and then any leftover points you have, if you can, maybe add a unit of Fellbats. Otherwise, this plays very similarly to your 500 point list. Use your Necromancer to increase the movement of your infantry, but also raise more zombies and buff them up to be a large tar pit. We gave a battle standard bearer to our right lord, and that is because BSB is insanely important for vampire counts, and that's going to help a lot. Go ahead and put that lord within your graveguard and let him do his thing. And then your Blood Knights are going to be the powerhouse of this list. They're going to hit hard. They are a bit of a glass cannon though, so if you can, try to keep your Necromancer as close to them as possible so you can revive fallen knights. So yeah, because we don't have a lot of new purchases here, hopefully you can focus more on painting than destroying your bank account. The newer Blood Knight models are really cool, nobody's going to deny that, but keep in mind that these models are quite large, and even with the larger base sizes of the old world, you'll have to be very careful to get these to rank up properly. Otherwise, the older kit is still relatively available, and you have some great options from third-party miniatures like Last Sword or again Highland miniatures. If money is not an obstacle for you, consider getting more than one of these kits. For starters, we're going to need a full unit eventually, but these bits are also great conversion fodder both for your own custom vampires and for a mounted necromancer that you're going to need later. So again, I don't think this list is overly competitive, but I also don't think it's a slouch either, especially bringing a necromancer lord and blood knights at this point level. I recommend you talk to your opponent first, make sure they're okay with it, and if not, go ahead and make adjustments. Remember, like, this game should be fun for both parties involved. It's just a truism that at lower point levels, the Warhammer Fantasy rank and file games have a hard time balancing out. But that does bring us to the 1500 point list, and in my opinion, this is where things start to get really interesting and fun. Our trusty Necromancer has got an upgrade and now has an undead steed, and we are finally bringing a vampire into this list, even if it's just a vampire thrall. Brought in some Fellbats to help with our direwolves. The Fellbats will now focus on artillery while our direwolves can harass and screen our units along with our crypt ghouls. And then we have some black knights to help back up our blood knights. Our necromancer's main job now will be to follow our blood knights around and keeping them resurrected and keeping them churning out the wounds. These blood knights are glass cannons and they're very important to our list. We need to keep them going. And the Vampire Thrall will do basically the same thing for our infantry. They're there for support and to resurrect dead bodies. Unfortunately, vampires in this edition can't cast spells and armor unless you buy a very expensive magic armor, so instead of armor, we're going to use a talisman of protection. The Thrall will not have as easy of a time resurrecting zombies and graveguard as our on-foot necromancer did, but it will do for now. In an ideal world, I would probably ditch the crypt ghouls at this point and use the points for more zombies and then use a little extra for something else. But the way I always did escalation leagues is you can't remove units, so here they are. They're going to be our skirmishers, they're going to help screen. Overall, I feel this list is balanced and flavorful, and we don't have to spend that much more to get everything we need. If you were lucky enough to grab one of these bundles for close to retail in 2024, A, good for you, and B, you're probably in good shape. Otherwise, you're going to need to buy some Black Knights, some Blood Knights, and probably some Fellbats. Starting with the Blood Knights, and usually I'd encourage mixing a new kit with the older kit, but the scale difference between the new kit and the old kit would make it look ridiculous. You have to pick either one or the other in this case. Otherwise, it will look like you have 5 Blood Knights and then 5 squires trying to chase them down on donkeys. It's ridiculous. You could try some other third-party sellers as well, like Highlands makes some really good Blood Knights, but they scale better with the old ones than the new ones too. So really, if you're using the new Blood Knights, you're best off just buy another kit. Otherwise, you have a lot of options. The current Black Knight kit is objectively awesome. I do recommend to get it if you can afford it. It's one of the better GW kits, but obviously there's a lot of alternatives that work great. And unlike the Blood Knights, their proportions aren't insane, so they should play well with other third-party kits if you want to mix and match. The giant Fellbats from GW are kinda cool, but honestly they're very expensive, and no one will blame you for finding a different alternative. And I mean, the idea of a Fellbat's very open to interpretation, so you can probably find a swarm of regular sized bats to put on a base for very cheap. This brings us to our last two units, and here we can have a lot of fun. GW is currently selling a lot of different vampires, and some of them have extremely different themes than the other ones. My only major gripe with these models is in their current Age of Sigmar setting. Apparently vampires are supposed to be like 9 feet tall, and so these are all insanely scaled. The Crimson Court models in particular I really like, but they are all super large and they look ridiculous next to your other units. This model in particular I really like, I just hate how large it is. I would pay good money to have someone scale it down. But if you insist on sticking with a current GW kit, their generic vampire on foot is probably the way to go. It's large, but it's not scaled so large it doesn't work. And if you're into role-playing or thematic armies, the model is androgynous enough that it could be a male vampire, a female vampire, or an undead Orlando Bloom. Of course, if you're willing to shell out the money, GW used to make a lot of awesome vampires that scaled really well. These models go for quite a bit now, especially the Isabella and Vlad von Karstein, and even the Conrad von Karstein, because it's one of the best models for vampires that GW ever did. They're expensive and they're metal, which is hard to work with, but they are objectively very cool if you're willing to invest in it. And of course, companies like Last Sword or Highland Miniatures make plenty of Warhammer Fantasy styled vampires to choose from as well if you want to go that direction. Last but not least, you have to figure out how to get a mounted Necromancer. GW gives you the option of mounting your Necromancer, but to my knowledge they have never sold a mounted Necromancer model. Your only options here will be to kit bash. You could take some of your undead horses, a leftover undead horse from either your Black Knight kit or your Blood Knight kit, and then maybe find an old mounted wizard and kinda, got them up a little bit. Or you could work with one of those third-party vendors. I'm sure one of them sells a mounted Necromancer somewhere. If you want to go this route, I highly recommend checking out the Vampire Counts thread on the 9th Age forums. I also think with a little bit of work, the old Herald of Decay model can make a very cool mounted Necromancer. Can't do it with the new model because it's too large, but if you can get your hands on the old model with a little bit of work, you can change it into a big My Chemical Romance fan. In either case, my advice to you would be to take your time and think this through and do something you're very happy with. This is a great chance for you to personalize your army and really make it yours. And this finally brings us to our end goal, our 2,000 point Vampire Counts army list. Look, this list probably won't win you any tournaments, but it is great for casual play and makes for a very thematic army. For our last 500 points, we are finally bringing a true to God vampire count for our Vampire Counts army. And because it's cool as hell, we're putting him on a big ass zombie dragon as well. We bring back our Necromancer on foot model to act as a resurrection slave, and then we now have a second unit of zombies, as well as adding more Graveguard. The second unit of zombies means you're gonna have to have 80 zombie models in total in case you resurrect both to full strength. And I do recognize that this is a very daunting task. However, You could use zombies from a few different suppliers, so you have a little variety there. You kind of break it up a little bit, you're painting different things, and this is a great time to learn how to use unit fillers. The idea of this army is basically the same as it was as 1500 points, except now we have an additional vampire on a big ass dragon to fight with. We don't waste any money on him on spells because we don't want him out of combat casting spells. We want him constantly in combat as basically a brand new version of the old Blender Lord. The additional Necromancer will help keep our tar pits topped off, and when we use our fell bats to chase artillery, our dire wolves and crypt ghouls to screen, and our blood knights and black knights to punish our enemies. And luckily there aren't a lot of extra purchases here. You're probably going to need some more zombies, and then of course your vampire on zombie dragon. Like all great GW models, this model has a lot of details. It's very cool, but also very expensive. That being said, I doubt you thought about putting together a Vampire Counts army and haven't wanted this particular model, so I'm just going to assume you're going to use it. But if not, giant undead dragons seems to be something that 3D modelers really like to play with, so there are literally dozens of models to replace this one that you could use if you don't like the official version. And keep in mind, this is just one way to get to 2000 points of vampire counts. Back when Warhammer Fantasy was a thing, the vampire counts were one of the most popular armies and thus have some of the most unit diversity in the setting. There are a lot of interesting and powerful units that unfortunately I never had time to even talk about in this video, that once you get comfortable with this army, you'll probably want to add so you can do your own experimenting with them. I know this video is already long, but as promised, I do want to quickly touch on the screamer list for vampire counts in the old world. I don't want to present myself as an expert on the subject, but for those of you who don't know, this screamer list is an alternative way to play vampire counts that is quite cheesy and has had some success in tournaments and is really good for a competitive list, but might make people angry in a more casual environment. The basic idea is to load up your army list with models that have the Wailing Dirge special rule and then ways to lower your opponent's leadership, and then you use Wailing Dirge attack on them. Your opponent won't be allowed any kind of save except for a ward save, so if you can get their leadership low enough, you can put out an insane amount of wounds quickly. This is especially effective against those who use low wound count armies or those who rely on big creatures like dragons. However, I should point out that a lot of people feel like the way this rule is working is not how GW intended, so if the Legacy army lists do get any further FAQs, there's a good chance this gets nerfed. So if you're building an army from scratch just for this, buyer beware. I should also point out that this army list right here is probably not fully optimized. I'm sure there's plenty of people who will point out how to make this list better in the comments, but this is just supposed to be an example. This style of list will have a hard time functioning at less than 2000 points. Unlike the lists I built for before, which are built for Escalation League, I really only would start with the Screamer list at 2000. It would not be fun in an Escalation League anyways. If you are looking for a bundle to save money, you're not going to find it in any recent GW set. However, if you can get your hands on the old Start Collecting Flesh Eater Quartz box, this might help a lot. It's getting really hard to find boxes like this for retail, but if you can, it's going to give you your Crypt Horrors, one of your Terrorgeist, and the vampire on top works really well as a Strigoi vampire, which a lot of Screamer lists do use. Other than that, you're looking at buying individual kits. You should be able to find a lot of different Banshee options if you don't like the GW ones or don't want to pay the money. But as far as your Mortis engine goes, I haven't seen a third-party one I really like. I would recommend getting the GW version of that at least. It's basically your centerpiece model and it's worth investing into. Overall, this list is highly specialized, and I think in most games you won't want to use it anyways unless you're taking it to a tournament. If you're new to Warhammer Fantasy and this is your first army, I highly recommend at least building the normal army to start with, and then once you have that core built together, then branch off and build your Screamer list. I think it's a mistake to build only for a Screamer list and have nothing else. But hey, that's just my opinion. I know this video was long, and thank you so much if you made it this far. I'm sure plenty of people have comments about my lists. That's just the way games like this works. People love to optimize things. If you have a way to make my list better, or you just want to tell me how terrible they are, go ahead and leave a comment. I'm sure it'll help other people as they read these and start to make their own lists. Otherwise, as always, thanks for watching. I truly do appreciate it.